When people talk about the civil rights movement now, it's usually softened. They remember speeches, they remember quotes, they remember a version of history that feels calm and resolved. What they forget is that the movement didn't succeed because it was polite. It succeeded because it was organized, relentless, and deeply disruptive to the status quo. And that matters because people organizing today are often told they're doing too much, asking for too much, or moving too fast. Between the early 1960s and the mid-1960s, Black organizers built mass movements that forced structural change. Not vibes, not awareness campaigns. They used boycotts, strikes, mass registration drives, coordinated protests, and legal pressure to attack specific systems: segregated schools, voter suppression, housing discrimination, labor exclusion. This organizing led directly to policy: the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the end of Jim Crow as a legal system. These wins didn't come from moral appeals alone. They came from leverage, economic, political, and social, applied consistently. This movement worked because it understood something crucial. Power doesn't concede because it's persuaded. It concedes because the cost of refusing becomes too high. Organizers targeted institutions. They built coalitions across churches, labor, students, and communities. They stayed focused on clear demands that could be enforced through law. This wasn't passive resistance, it was strategic confrontation. Understanding this matters because the civil rights movement didn't end in justice. It changed the terrain. And once the law shifted, new questions emerged. Who controls resources? Who controls policing? Who controls housing, jobs, and schools? Those unanswered questions are what gave rise to the Black Power era. And if we don't understand why, we can't understand what came next, or how to organize effectively now. After the Civil Rights Acts passed, a lot of people were told the fight was over. The laws changed, the signs came down, the cameras moved on, but daily life didn't suddenly become safe, stable, or free. Police violence continued, economic exclusion continued, housing segregation continued, schools stayed underfunded. For many Black communities, freedom still felt theoretical. That gap between legal equality and lived reality is where Black Power emerged. Black Power wasn't a rejection of civil rights. It was a response to its limits. Legal rights didn't automatically create economic power. Voting rights didn't guarantee housing, jobs, or safety. Integration didn't mean control over institutions that shaped daily life. So organizers began asking different questions. Who controls the schools in our neighborhoods? Who controls the police? Who controls land, food, healthcare, and work? Black Power emphasized self-determination, community control, political education, and collective survival. This included community patrols against police violence, free breakfast programs, health clinics, political education, independent schools. These weren't symbolic gestures. They were attempts to build power where the state had failed. What's often erased is that Black Power wasn't anti-democratic. It was deeply democratic, just skeptical of a system that offered rights without resources. The movement understood something crucial. Political equality means little without economic and institutional power to back it up. This shift scared the state far more than moral appeals ever had. Black Power emerged because organizers recognized that winning laws wasn't the same as winning control, and that insight still matters today. Because whenever communities start building alternatives, not just asking for inclusion, power responds differently. Understanding that response is key to understanding why the movement was disrupted and what modern organizers need to do differently to survive. When people talk about the end of the Black Power movement, the story usually gets flattened. Either it's framed as inevitable, or it's blamed entirely on the people inside it. Both versions miss the truth. Movements don't disappear because they're wrong. They disappear because they threaten power, and power responds. The Black Power era was met with coordinated state repression, surveillance, infiltration, criminalization, targeted arrests, leadership assassinations. Programs like COINTELPRO weren't abstract. They were designed to fracture trust, escalate conflict, and destroy organizing capacity from the inside. But repression wasn't the only factor. These movements were also under-resourced, isolated from broader coalitions, and forced into constant crisis mode. When survival becomes urgent every day, long-term strategy becomes harder to sustain. And when leaders are hunted, exhausted, or isolated, internal fractures deepen. What often gets ignored is this. The state didn't just attack militancy, it attacked community control, free food programs, health clinics, political education, independent institutions. Those were the real threat, because they reduced dependence on systems built to extract and control. At the same time, internal challenges emerged, ego replacing accountability, ideological purity tests replacing coalition building, and isolation making movements easier to divide and destroy. None of this erases the movement's vision. It explains the conditions it was forced to operate under. The lesson isn't don't resist. The lesson is that power responds hardest when movements begin meeting people's needs and challenging who controls resources. Modern organizers need both courage and structure, security and coalition, care and strategy, because movements don't fail when they're too radical. They fail when they're forced to carry everything alone. And that's a lesson worth learning, not to discourage organizing, but to make it survivable this time. When people talk about the decline of the Black Power era, they often skip over something important. They talk about repression. They talk about collapse. They talk about what didn't last. Movements were also under-resourced, isolated from broader coalitions, and forced into constant crisis mode. When survival becomes urgent every day, long-term strategy becomes harder to sustain. And when leaders are hunted, exhausted, or isolated, internal fractures deepen. What often gets ignored is this. The state didn't just attack militancy, it attacked community control. Free food programs, health clinics, political education, independent institutions, those were the real threat because they reduced dependence on systems built to extract and control. At the same time, internal challenges emerged, ego replacing accountability, ideological purity tests replacing coalition building, and isolation making movements easier to divide and destroy. None of this erases the movement's vision. It explains the conditions it was forced to operate under. The lesson isn't don't resist. The lesson is that power responds hardest when movements begin meeting people's needs and challenging who controls resources. Modern organizers need both courage and structure, security and coalition, care and strategy, because movements don't fail when they're too radical. They fail when they're forced to carry everything alone. And that's a lesson worth learning, not to discourage organizing, but to make it survivable this time. When people talk about the decline of the Black Power era, they often skip over something important. They talk about repression. They talk about collapse. They talk about what didn't last. What rarely gets named is what did change permanently, because people organized hard enough to force it. Not everything was reversed, and not everything was symbolic. Community organizing during and after the Black Power era led to real policy and structural shifts. Desegregation enforcement didn't just happen automatically. It was fought for, monitored, and pressured into existence. Public investment expanded. Head Start programs, community health centers, school lunch and nutrition programs, legal aid services, affirmative action, policies in education and employment. Black elected officials increased at local and national levels. Voting power translated into representation in cities that had been locked out for generations. These weren't concessions out of goodwill. They were responses to sustained pressure. What's important is how these wins happened. They didn't come from visibility alone. They came from organized communities that named specific demands, targeted institutions, built coalitions across labor, faith, and neighborhood groups, and stayed engaged after laws passed. Policy didn't replace organizing. Organizing made policy enforceable. And when organizing weakened, enforcement weakened too. That's not a failure of democracy. It's a reminder of how fragile gains are without continued pressure. These wins matter because they show something critical. Even under extreme repression, movements changed material conditions. Not perfectly, not permanently, but measurably. The lesson for today isn't nostalgia, it's strategy. What organizing works, especially when it's tied to clear demands and durable structures. And if people want change that lasts, they don't just need laws. Talking about where movements fractured can feel risky. People worry it sounds like blame, like judgment, like rewriting history to make resistance look irresponsible. But avoiding this conversation doesn't protect movements. It leaves new organizers walking into the same traps without a map. Learning what went wrong is an act of care. The fractures weren't about lack of courage, they were about conditions. Movements were operating under constant surveillance and repression. Leaders were targeted, jailed, or killed. Resources were scarce. Burnout was relentless. Under that pressure, common fault lines appeared. Charismatic leadership replacing shared accountability, ideological purity replacing coalition building, internal conflict escalating without structures to contain it, and isolation making groups easier to infiltrate and divide. None of this means the vision was flawed. It means the container wasn't strong enough for the weight it was carrying. They need organized communities strong enough to defend them. Here's the part that matters for today. Power doesn't just attack movements from the outside. It creates conditions where movements turn inward. When people are exhausted, conflict feels personal. When resources are scarce, trust erodes faster. When there's no rest, everything becomes urgent. And urgency burns people out. This isn't a moral failure, it's a structural one. Or movements need systems for conflict, care, leadership rotation, and collective decision-making, or they fracture under pressure. The lesson isn't to be quieter or less ambitious. The lesson is to build movements that are harder to break, shared leadership instead of saviors, coalitions instead of silos, rhythm instead of constant crisis, and structures that protect people as much as they confront power. Learning this doesn't dishonor past struggles. It honors them by refusing to repeat their losses. And it gives today's organizers something precious, not just anger, but a way forward that can actually last. A lot of people look back at the civil rights and Black Power eras and feel two things at once: respect and distance. Like that kind of organizing belonged to a different time, different conditions, different people. But the truth is, many of the pressures organizers faced then are familiar now: economic precarity, surveillance, burnout, fragmentation, and being told their demands are unrealistic. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it does rhyme. What those movements teach us is that organizing works best when it's grounded in daily life. People didn't mobilize because they agreed on every ideology. They mobilized because segregation, police violence, housing exclusion, and labor exploitation shaped their survival. The most effective organizing connected big visions to concrete struggles: jobs, schools, housing, safety, healthcare. That's still true. Movements lose momentum when they float above material conditions. They gain power when they change them. This history also shows what capitalism fears most: not protest alone, not slogans, but organized communities that meet needs, build alternatives, and reduce dependence on profit-driven systems. When people control food, housing, labor, and care, leverage shifts. That's why repression intensifies when organizing becomes durable, not just loud. It's also why modern movements need structure. coalitions instead of silos, shared leadership instead of saviors, clear demands instead of endless discourse, and rhythms that allow people to stay. The lesson isn't to copy the past, it's to adapt its wisdom, build where people already feel pressure, organize in layers, protect each other from burnout, tie vision to material change. The people who came before didn't organize because victory was guaranteed. They organized because survival demanded it. That same demand exists now, and this time, we have history not just as inspiration, but as instruction. If you're trying to organize right now, it can feel overwhelming. The systems are bigger. The stakes feel higher. The pressure to survive is constant. And it's easy to look at history and think they were braver or they were stronger. But that's not true. They were tired too. They were scared too. They were organizing inside systems designed to break them, just like now. What carried movements forward wasn't perfection or certainty. It was people choosing to act together anyway. They didn't wait for ideal conditions. They didn't agree on everything. They built power in pieces, workplace by workplace, block by block, city by city. And when they won ground, they fought to hold it. That's the part capitalism tries hardest to erase, that ordinary people, organized over time, have already forced massive change. The goal today isn't to recreate the past, it's to learn from it without shame, to organize in ways that are harder to isolate, to build coalitions that don't collapse under pressure, to pair resistance with care, to design movements people can stay in, because capitalism doesn't fall when people are angry. It cracks when people are organized, connected, and durable. You don't need to save the world. You need to change one set of conditions with other people. Start where pressure already exists. Build a we before a movement. Protect your energy like it matters, because it does. History doesn't say this work is easy, it says it's possible. And the fact that these systems still spend so much energy suppressing organizing means the threat has never gone away. That's not a reason to despair. It's proof that what you're doing still matters. If this history gave you clarity instead of despair, share it with someone who's trying to organize but feels overwhelmed. Not to convince them, to remind them they're not alone. What's one lesson from past movements that feels relevant right now? Name it in the comments. And if you want more grounded, system-level breakdowns like this, subscribe to the channel at NeuroNoor Healing. Tap the bell for alerts. We're here for durable change and regulation that prevents burnout.